The Boeing B-17 is a familiar shape in the sky. We see it in old films and photographs. Four engines, a glass nose, guns sticking out from every angle. We call it the Flying Fortress. But the name and the image hide a much deeper story. A story about people, not just machines. A story about quiet failures and surprising successes. What if the most important part of the B-17 wasn't its guns, but a piece of paper? What if its greatest weakness was the one thing everyone thought was its greatest strength? And what did the crews really fear more than anything else at 30,000 feet? The answers are not what you think. They are found in forgotten reports, in the memories of the engineers who built it, and in the quiet struggles of the 10-man crews who flew it. Number 20. Could a simple piece of paper have saved the B-17? It all could have ended before it even began. The plane we know as the B-17 almost never happened. It crashed on its big day. The date was October 30th, 1935. The place was Wright Field in Ohio. The U.S. Army Air Corps was watching. They needed a new bomber. Boeing brought their prototype, the Model 299. It was a giant compared to the other planes. It had four engines, while its competitor, the Douglas B-18 Bolo, had only two. The Boeing plane looked like the future. The crew climbed in. Major Ployer P. Hill was the pilot. Les Tower was the co-pilot. They were experienced men. The engine started up, a deep rumble that promised power. The plane taxied down the runway. It gathered speed. And then it lifted off the ground, a smooth, beautiful ascent, but only for a moment. The aircraft pitched up sharply, uncontrollably. It climbed almost vertically, lost all flying speed, stalled, and then fell back to the ground. It exploded on impact. Major Hill and Les Tower were killed. The Army's initial reaction was what you might expect. The plane was too complicated. It was, as one newspaper headline put it, too much plane for one man to fly. It seemed the smaller, simpler Douglas B-18 was the safer, more sensible choice. The dream of a four-engine heavy bomber was about to die in the wreckage at Wright Field, but some people in the Air Corps still believed in the Boeing design. They saw its potential. They ordered a small number for further testing, but the big contract went to Douglas. The B-17 was on life support. The investigation into the crash found something surprising. It wasn't a mechanical failure. The engines worked perfectly, the controls were fine, the cause was human error, but it was an understandable error. Before takeoff, pilots of large aircraft would lock the control surfaces, like the elevators and rudder, to prevent them from flapping in the wind and getting damaged. They used a simple metal clamp called a gust lock. The pilots of the Model 299 had forgotten to remove it. With the elevators locked in place, they could not control the plane's pitch. The crash was inevitable. It was a simple, tragic mistake. The pilots were not careless, they were overwhelmed. The cockpit of the Model 299 was far more complex than anything they had flown before. There were so many switches, gauges, and levers. Forgetting one small step was easy to do. A group of test pilots got together after the accident. They knew the problem wasn't the men or the machine, but the process. They had to find a way to manage the complexity. Their solution wasn't a new piece of technology, it wasn't a buzzer or a warning light. It was a piece of paper. They created a checklist. It was a simple list of things to do for takeoff, for flight, for landing, and for taxiing. It was a step-by-step guide. The pilot would read an item, and the co-pilot would confirm it was done. It was methodical, it was boring, and it worked. The checklist offloaded the pilot's memory. He didn't have to remember every single thing. He just had to follow the list. This simple innovation saved the B-17 program. The Army pilots used the checklist on the few test models they had, and they flew them without incident. The Army's confidence grew. They eventually ordered more. That piece of paper turned too much plane for one man to fly into a manageable, reliable aircraft. The pre-flight checklist is now a standard, non-negotiable part of aviation all over the world, for every pilot, from a small Cessna to an Airbus A380. Its origin story begins in the tragic crash of the very first Flying Fortress. Author and pilot Ernest K. Gann wrote extensively in his book, Fate is the Hunter, about the pilot's reliance on process over raw talent, and the checklist is the ultimate embodiment of that idea. But what if the test pilots had just blamed Major Hill for the crash? How many other accidents would have followed before someone realized the real problem was human memory itself? If the Model 299 had not crashed that day, would the concept of the checklist have taken much longer to become standard practice in aviation? And what simple, low-tech solutions like the checklist are we overlooking today in our most complex systems, from artificial intelligence to space travel? Number 19, why was the safest place also the worst? Look at a diagram of a B-17. You see the cockpit for the pilots, you see the glass nose for the bombardier and navigator. You see the radio operator's room, you see the waist gun positions, and then tucked away underneath the plane you see a small cramped sphere. That was the Sperry Ball turret. It held one man and 2.50 caliber machine guns. From a purely statistical standpoint, it was one of the safest positions on the aircraft. It was a small target, and being on the bottom, it was less exposed to attacks from above and the front, which were common. But the men who flew in it hated it. Many would say it was the worst job on the plane. The reason was psychological, not statistical. The ball turret was an isolation chamber. To get into it, the gunner had to wait until the plane was in the air. The turret was then lowered into position. He would squeeze his body into a fetal position, his back and head against a curved plate, his feet in stirrups, and his hands on the controls for the guns. He was completely alone, disconnected from the rest of the crew. He could talk to them over the intercom, but he couldn't see them. His entire world was the plexiglass bubble and the sky below. The space was incredibly tight. A man of average height would have his knees almost to his chest. There was no room to move, no room to stretch. For hours on end, he would be trapped in this tiny sphere. And there was a terrifying catch. The turret's entry door was inside the plane's fuselage. If the plane's hydraulic or electrical systems were damaged, the turret could get stuck in the down position. If the landing gear was also damaged and the plane had to make a belly landing, the ball turret would be the first thing to hit the ground. The gunner would be crushed. There was no way to escape. This fear was a constant companion for every man who occupied that position. And furthermore, they were not issued a parachute to wear inside the turret. It was simply too small. Their parachute was stored in the main fuselage. If the plane was critically damaged and the crew had to bail out, the ball turret gunner had to go through a terrifyingly complex procedure. He had to rotate the turret so the guns were pointing straight down. Then he had to open the small door on the back of the turret, pull himself out and back up into the fuselage, find his parachute, clip it on, and then get to an escape hatch. This all had to happen in seconds, inside a falling, potentially burning aircraft. The chances were slim. Sergeant Ray Zuko, a ball turret gunner, described the experience in his memoirs. He talked about the intense cold, the constant vibration, and the feeling of being a fish in a bowl. He knew that if the plane went down, his odds were worse than anyone else's, not because he was more likely to be hit, but because he was the last one who could get out. The psychological burden of that knowledge was immense. Studies on combat stress, like the ones conducted by Roy Grinker and John Spiegel, and detailed in their book Men Under Stress, found that feelings of helplessness and lack of control were major contributors to psychological breakdown. The ball turret was a machine designed to maximize feelings of helplessness. You were trapped, you were alone, and your survival depended entirely on the integrity of the machine and the actions of others. It may have been a safe spot on a chart, but for the man inside, it felt like the most vulnerable place in the world. So how many ball turret gunners were lost not to enemy fire, but because they simply couldn't get out of a damaged plane in time? Did the designers at the Sperry Gyroscope Company ever fully consider the psychological impact of their design, or were they focused purely on the engineering problem of providing defensive fire from below? And if you could redesign the ball turret today, knowing what we know about human psychology and stress, what would you change first? Number 18, did a secret weapon hide in the engines? When people talk about the B-17's strengths, they usually mention the number of guns or its tough airframe. But one of its most important advantages was almost invisible. It was a piece of technology tucked away with the engines, a device that allowed the Flying Fortress to live up to its name and operate in a realm where its opponents struggled with thin, cold air of high altitude. This device was the turbo-supercharger. Most engines lose power as they climb higher. The air gets thinner, which means there's less oxygen to burn with the fuel. A standard engine at 20,000 feet might only produce half the power it does at sea level. This was a huge problem for early bombers. They had to fly lower, which made them easy targets for anti-aircraft guns on the ground. The turbo-supercharger, pioneered in the United States by General Electric's Sanford Moss, solved this problem. It was essentially a tiny turbine wheel that was spun by the hot exhaust gases coming out of the engine. This wheel, spinning at over 20,000 revolutions per minute, was connected to a compressor that would suck in the thin, cold outside air, compress it, and force it into the engine. The engine was, in effect, being tricked into thinking it was still at sea level, where the air is dense. This gave the B-17 a massive strategic advantage. It could fly at altitudes of 25,000 to 30,000 feet, an area pilots called coffin corner because of the difficulty of flying there. At this height, it was above the effective range of most anti-aircraft artillery for much of the war. It also made it harder for enemy fighter planes to intercept them. The German Messerschmitt Bf 109, a formidable opponent, struggled at these high altitudes. Its engine performance dropped off significantly, making it sluggish and less maneuverable. The B-17s, with their turbo-supercharged right cyclone engines, could maintain speed and performance, flying in formation for mutual defense. The development of this technology was not easy. Sanford Moss, an engineer at General Electric, had been working on the concept since World War I. His first prototype was tested on Pikes Peak in Colorado in 1918 to prove it could work in thin air. But the material science was a major hurdle. The turbine wheel had to withstand temperatures of over 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit while spinning at incredible speeds. Early models would fail or simply melt. It took years of research throughout the 1920s and 30s, developing new metal alloys that could handle the heat and stress to make the turbo supercharger reliable enough for military use. By the time the B-17 was being designed, GE had a working, reliable unit. The B-17 was one of the first production aircraft to be designed around this technology from the start. The turbo-supercharger system was complex. Each of the 4 engines had its own unit, controlled by a delicate system of regulators and wastegates that the pilot and flight engineer had to manage carefully. But the payoff was immense. It allowed the 8th Air Force to develop its strategy of high-altitude, daylight precision bombing. Without the turbo-supercharger, that entire doctrine would have been impossible. The B-17 would have been a medium-altitude bomber, vulnerable and far less effective. This one piece of hidden technology, born from an engineer's idea on a Colorado mountaintop 2 decades earlier, fundamentally shaped the air war over Europe. It was the B-17's secret weapon, humming away inside the engine nacelles, unseen and often unappreciated. But how much did the B-17's opponents know about its high-altitude performance capabilities early on, and how did it affect their own aircraft design priorities? Was the focus on high-altitude flight a strategic gamble by the USAF, betting on a technology that was still relatively new and complex? And what would the air war have looked like if Sanford Moss had failed in his high-altitude tests on Pikes Peak all those years ago? Number 17 was the B-17, a failure in the Pacific. The classic image of the B-17 is of a silver plane flying high over Europe, leaving white contrails in the cold blue sky. Its story is almost always tied to the 8th Air Force and the campaign against Germany. But the B-17 also fought in a very different war, in a very different environment, the Pacific Theater. And its experience, there was a world away from its European service. In many ways, the early days of the B-17 in the Pacific were marked by failure and frustration. The war in the Pacific started with B-17s being caught on the ground. On December 7th, 1941, a flight of unarmed B-17s was arriving at Hickam Field in Hawaii from the mainland during the attack on Pearl Harbor. They were flying into a war zone without knowing it. More B-17s were destroyed on the ground in the Philippines in the days that followed. The Far East Air Force was crippled before it could even mount a serious defense. The planes that survived were forced to retreat, first to the Dutch East Indies and then to Australia. The B-17s that did fly missions faced a completely different set of challenges than their counterparts in Europe. The vast distances of the Pacific Ocean were a major problem. Missions were long, often lasting 10 or 12 hours, pushing the planes and crews to the limits of their endurance. Navigation over the featureless ocean was incredibly difficult. Unlike Europe, with its cities, rivers, and roads, there were few landmarks. A small error in navigation could mean missing an island target and getting lost over the sea. The B-17 was designed as a high-altitude bomber, but this doctrine proved less effective in the Pacific. The weather was a constant enemy. Thick cloud cover often obscured targets, forcing bombers to go in at lower altitudes where they were more vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. The primary targets were often ships, which were fast-moving and difficult to hit from 25,000 feet. The Japanese A-6M Zero fighter was also a very different opponent from the German fighters in Europe. The Zero was incredibly agile and could outmaneuver the B-17 easily, especially at lower altitudes. It was not as heavily armed as a German fighter, but its pilots were skilled, and they quickly learned to attack the B-17 from the front, where its defensive armament was weakest in the early models. General George C. Kenney, who took command of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, recognized that the B-17 was not the right tool for the job of skip bombing ships or providing close air support for ground troops. He wrote in his memoirs, General Kenney reports, that he needed planes that could operate at low levels and carry more versatile bomb loads. He began to phase out the B-17 in favor of bombers like the B-25, Mitchell, and the B-24 Liberator. The B-24 in particular had a longer range and a larger bomb bay, making it better suited for the long-haul missions of the Pacific. By 1943, the B-17 was largely gone from frontline bombing duty in the Pacific. They were not useless, however. They were converted into armed transports called flying boxcars and used for long-range reconnaissance missions designated F-9. In these roles, their reliability and endurance were still valuable. But the dream of the B-17 as the decisive strategic weapon of the Pacific War never came true. It was a plane designed for a specific type of war, and the war in the Pacific was something else entirely. Its story there is a reminder that even a great machine can fail if it's used in the wrong context. Why was the strategic bombing doctrine, so central to USAF thinking, applied so rigidly in the Pacific at first, despite the different nature of the targets and environment? If the B-24 Liberator was better suited for the Pacific, why was the B-17 sent there in such numbers in the first place? And what lessons did the Air Force learn from the B-17's difficult Pacific service that influenced the design of future bombers like the B-29? Number 16, could one man's mistake create a legend? The name is famous, the Memphis Belle. It was the B-17 that became a symbol of the American war effort. It was the subject of a famous 1944 documentary directed by William Wyler. It was said to be the first B-17 to complete 25 combat missions over Europe and return its crew home safely. The crew went on a national tour promoting war bonds and boosting morale. The plane itself was saved from the scrap heap and is now preserved in a museum. It's a great story, but part of it might not be true. The 25 mission tour was a milestone. The odds of a bomber crew surviving that many missions in 1942 and early 1943 were very low. The 8th Air Force decided that crews who reached this magic number could return to the United States. And it was a powerful incentive and a source of hope. The story of the first crew to achieve this was bound to be a major propaganda victory. The crew of the Memphis Belle, led by Captain Robert Morgan, was chosen for this honor. Their final mission was on May 17th, 1943. The documentary crew was there to film it. They returned safely, and the legend was born. However, research by aviation historians, particularly from records held at the Air Force Historical Research Agency, has uncovered a more complicated picture. Another B-17 named Hell's Angels from the 303rd Bomb Group appears to have completed its 25th mission 2 days earlier on May 13th, 1943. So why did the Memphis Belle get all the fame? The answer seems to lie in a combination of public relations, timing, and a simple reporting error. The crew of the Hell's Angels was not kept together as a single unit for their entire tour in the same way the Memphis Belle crew was. Some members had finished their tours earlier than others. This made them a less cohesive poster boy crew for a war bond tour. The Memphis Belle crew, on the other hand, had largely flown together from the start. They were a perfect symbol. More importantly, the public relations machine of the USAF was already in motion. William Wyler and his film crew were already attached to the Memphis Belle's group, the 91st Bomb Group. filming for weeks, capturing the life of the crew and the tension of their missions. The story was already written, it just needed its final chapter. There is also evidence of a clerical error. A war correspondent named Clark Gable, the famous actor who flew several combat missions himself, was at the Hells Angels base. He reportedly filed a story about them completing their 25 missions, but it may have been delayed or misreported. Meanwhile, the press release about the Memphis Belle, prepared and ready to go, was sent out immediately. In the days before instant communication, the first story to get out was the one that stuck. By the time the full record of Hell's Angels was clear, the Memphis Belle was already a household name. The documentary was being made and, the crew was on their national tour. The narrative was set in stone. This doesn't diminish the courage or the achievement of the Memphis Belle's crew. Completing 25 missions was an incredible feat, no matter who did it first. But it shows how history is sometimes shaped by chance and by the needs of propaganda. The story needed a hero, a single identifiable symbol. The Memphis Belle and her crew fit that role perfectly. The Hells Angels and its crew, who may have earned the title first, remain a footnote, a piece of trivia for dedicated historians. The legend of the Memphis Belle was created not just by its crew's bravery, but by the power of a good story, well told and released at just the right time. Does it really matter who was first, or is the symbol of completing the tour the more important historical fact? How many other firsts in history are the result of better public relations rather than actual chronological order? And if the Hells Angels had been chosen for the War Bond Tour instead, would its story have resonated with the public in the same way? Number 15, why did they build a B-17 that couldn't drop bombs? The theory behind the B-17 was simple. It was a flying fortress. It was supposed to be able to fly into enemy territory, defend itself with its own guns, drop its bombs, and fly home. The bombers would fly in tight formations, creating overlapping fields of fire that would, in theory, shred any attacking fighter planes. But the reality of combat in 1942 and 1943 was brutal. The formations were being attacked relentlessly, and the losses were staggering. The .50 caliber machine guns of the B-17s were powerful, but they were not enough. The bombers were vulnerable, especially from the front. The Air Force needed a solution, and it led to one of the strangest and least successful variants of the B-17 ever built, the YB-40. The Y in its designation stood for service test, and the B for bomber was a bit of a misnomer. The YB-40 was not a bomber, it was a gunship. It was a B-17 stripped of its bomb bay. In place of the bombs, it carried a massive amount of extra ammunition for its machine guns. It also carried extra guns. A second powered turret was installed on top, where the radio operator's single gun used to be. A yin turret was added under the nose, which would later become standard on the B-17G model. In total, a YB-40 could carry up to 14 machine guns and over 11,000 rounds of ammunition, more than double that of a standard B-17F. The idea was to mix these YB-40 gunships into the bomber formations. They would be flying bodyguards bristling with extra firepower to protect the bomb-carrying planes. On paper, it seemed like a brilliant idea. A company called Vega, a subsidiary of Lockheed, converted about 25 B-17Fs into the YB-40 configuration. In the spring of 1943, they were sent to England to be tested in combat with the 92nd Bomb Group. The experiment was a disaster. The YB-40 had several fatal flaws. First, it was too heavy. The extra guns, the extra turrets, and all that ammunition made the plane significantly heavier than a standard B-17. This meant it was slower and less nimble. It struggled to keep up with the main bomber formation, especially on the way to the target when the other B-17s were still loaded with bombs. But the biggest problem emerged after the bombs were dropped. Once the regular B-17s released their thousands of pounds of bombs, they became much lighter and faster. They would increase their speed for the journey home, trying to get out of enemy territory as quickly as possible. The YB-40, still weighed down with its guns and ammunition, could not keep up. The very planes it was designed to protect would fly away from it. The heavily armed bodyguard was left behind, slow and alone, making it an easy target for enemy fighters. Its defensive mission was a complete failure. The crews reported other problems too. The weight and balance of the aircraft were all wrong, making it difficult to fly. The sheer number of guns created logistical nightmares. After just a handful of missions between May and July 1943, the YB-40 project was canceled. The surviving planes were sent back to the United States and used for training. While the YB-40 itself was a failure, it wasn't a total loss. The experiment proved the value of the chin turret for defending against head-on attacks. This feature was quickly incorporated into the next major production model, the B-17G, which became the definitive version of the Flying Fortress. The YB-40 was a failed attempt to solve a deadly problem, but its failure provided a crucial lesson that ultimately made its sister planes more survivable. It was an evolutionary dead end that provided the blueprint for a more successful successor. Was the YB-40 a case of a good idea that was poorly executed, or was the fundamental concept of a bomber escort gunship always doomed to fail? How did the crews assigned to fly the YB-40 feel, knowing they were flying a test aircraft with no offensive capability into the most dangerous skies in the world? And if the YB-40 had been lighter and faster, could it have changed the course of the early air war before long-range fighters became available? Number 14, what was colder than the enemy? A B-17 crewman faced many dangers. There was anti-aircraft fire from the ground. There were enemy fighters in the air. But one of the most constant, relentless, and dangerous enemies was something they couldn't shoot back at the cold. The B-17 operated at altitudes of 5 miles or more, where the outside air temperature could drop to 40, 50, or even 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. At that temperature, metal becomes brittle, oil freezes, and human flesh can freeze solid in minutes. Surviving in that environment was a battle in itself. The B-17 was not a pressurized aircraft like a modern airliner. The crew was exposed to the ambient temperature and the thin, unbreathable air. They had to rely on heated suits and oxygen masks to stay alive. The heated suits were a marvel of early technology and a constant source of problems. They were essentially a set of long underwear with a web of electrical wires sewn into them. A crewman would plug his suit into the plane's electrical system. If it worked, it provided just enough warmth to keep him functional. But the system was notoriously unreliable. A wire could break, a plug could come loose, the plane's generator could fail. If a suit went out, the crewman was in immediate danger of frostbite and life-threatening hypothermia. Many veterans described the cold as a physical pain, a deep, aching misery that never went away. The waist gunners were particularly exposed. They stood by open windows with the 200-mile-per-hour slipstream of freezing air blasting them for hours on end. Their machine guns were made of metal, and touching one with a bare hand would instantly freeze the skin to it. They had to wear thick gloves, which made it hard to handle the guns or clear a jam. The oxygen system was another lifeline that was both a savior and a source of anxiety. Each man had a mask connected to the plane's oxygen supply. The rubber masks would often freeze, becoming stiff and uncomfortable. The moisture from a man's breath would freeze inside the mask or on the valves, cutting off his oxygen supply. A crewman who passed out from lack of oxygen, or anoxia, might only have a few seconds before suffering permanent brain damage or death. The crews had to constantly check their own masks and keep an eye on their crewmates for the telltale blue lips and sluggish movements that signaled oxygen starvation. This extreme environment took a heavy physical and mental toll. In his book A Wing and a Prayer, historian Harry H. Crosby, who served as a navigator on a B-17, described how the intense cold added to the stress of combat. It was a constant drain on a man's energy and focus. Everything was harder to do. Thinking was slower. Simple tasks required immense effort. The fear of a suit failure or an oxygen problem was a constant background noise to the more immediate fear of being shot down. The cold was a silent enemy that was always there, from the moment they climbed to altitude until the moment they landed. Many crewmen suffered from severe frostbite, losing fingers, toes, or parts of their face. For them, the scars of the war were not just from combat, but from simply surviving the brutal environment where they had to fight. How did the engineers who designed the B-17 in sunny California account for the extreme cold of the European stratosphere, and were early models unprepared for these conditions? What were the long-term health effects on the air crews who repeatedly endured these cycles of extreme cold and oxygen deprivation? And considering the technology of the 1940s, was there any better way to protect the crews, or was this suffering simply an unavoidable cost of high-altitude flight? Number 13, how do you build 12,000 airplanes? The numbers are hard to comprehend. Between 1936 and 1945, a total of 12,731 B-17 Flying Fortresses were built. At the peak of production, Boeing's Plant 2 in Seattle was rolling a new B-17 off the assembly line every 90 minutes. This was not just an act of manufacturing, it was an industrial miracle that transformed the landscape of American industry and society. The story of how these planes were built is as important as the story of how they flew. In the beginning, Boeing was building planes by hand. The first models were constructed in small batches by skilled craftsmen, but the demand of the war required a completely new way of thinking. The answer was the assembly line, a concept pioneered by the auto industry, but applied on a scale and complexity never seen before. To meet the demand, Boeing didn't just build the planes themselves, they created a production pool. Douglas Aircraft Company and the Vegas subsidiary of Lockheed were also brought in to build B-17s under license. A B-17 built by Douglas was designated a B-17F DL, for example. This massive collaboration was essential to reaching the required production numbers. The workforce that built these planes was also transformed. With millions of men serving in the military, the aviation industry turned to a new source of labor: women. The image of Rosie the Riveter is an iconic symbol of this era, and nowhere was it more real than in the aircraft plants. Women who had been homemakers, secretaries, or shop clerks were trained to be riveters, electricians, and mechanics. They worked in loud, sprawling factories, often around the clock. By 1943, women made up nearly half of the workforce in many aircraft plants. Their contribution was not just helpful, it was absolutely critical. Without them, the production targets would have been impossible to meet. Building a single B-17 was a monumental task. Each plane was made of roughly 1.2 million rivets and hundreds of thousands of individual parts, sourced from subcontractors all over the country. The logistics were staggering. A problem with a small supplier in Michigan could halt the entire assembly line in Seattle. The process had to be planned with military precision. The airframe would move down a long assembly line with specialized teams adding the wings, engines, wiring, plumbing, and finally the turrets and guns. In his book, The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, aviation historian Martin Kiden details how these production methods evolved, becoming more efficient with each month that passed. To hide the vital Boeing plant in Seattle from potential air attack, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers constructed an elaborate camouflage on its roof. They built a fake neighborhood. The 26-acre roof was covered with plywood houses, fake streets, trees, and cars. From the air, the factory completely disappeared, looking like a quiet residential suburb. This incredible feat of engineering and deception, detailed in military engineering archives, shows the lengths to which the country went to protect its industrial heartland. The B-17 was not just a product of a factory, it was the product of a nationwide coordinated effort that involved hundreds of companies and millions of people, all focused on a single goal. How did the massive influx of inexperienced workers, many of whom had never held a tool before, affect the quality control of the aircraft being produced? What long-term impact did the Rosie the Riveter experience have on the role of women in the American workforce after the war ended? And could the United States, with its modern, more automated industrial base, ever replicate such a massive, rapid manufacturing expansion today? Number 12. Did the most famous bomb sight actually work? It was one of the most secret and highly guarded pieces of technology of the war. It was the Norden bomb sight. The men who used it, the bombardiers, had to take an oath to protect it with their lives. If their plane was going down, their first duty was to destroy the bomb sight to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. It was hailed as a miracle device, a mechanical computer that could allow a B-17 to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. That was the legend. The reality was very different. The Norden bomb sight was a brilliant piece of engineering developed by Carl Norden, a Dutch engineer who had emigrated to the United States. It was a complex system of gyroscopes, gears, mirrors, and telescopes. To use it, the bombardier would input data about the plane's altitude, airspeed, and the wind direction and speed. He would then look through the eyepiece and locate the target. As the plane approached, the bomb sight would actually take control of the aircraft through a connection to the autopilot. For the final few moments of the bomb run, the bombardier, not the pilot, was flying the plane. The bomb sight would calculate the precise moment to release the bombs to hit the target. The pickle barrel accuracy was achieved, but only under perfect conditions. It was tested in the clear, calm skies of the American desert with no one shooting back. In the reality of combat over Europe, those conditions never existed. The sky was often filled with clouds, obscuring the target. The plane was being rocked by turbulence from anti-aircraft explosions. The bombardier was cold, tired, and terrified. The wind conditions could change rapidly. Under these real-world pressures, the incredible precision of the Norden bombsight was almost impossible to achieve. The 1944 report by the USAF's own Office of Statistical Control delivered a blunt assessment. It found that of all the bombs dropped on Germany in 1943, only about 20% landed within 1,000 feet of their aim point. The idea of precision bombing was more of a strategic goal than a tactical reality. The B-17s were dropping bombs on a target area, not a specific building. The Norden was certainly better than any other method available at the time, but it was not the surgical instrument of propaganda legend. Furthermore, the extreme secrecy surrounding the bomb site was probably unnecessary. The Germans had recovered a reasonably intact Norden as early as 1940. They studied it and were reportedly unimpressed. Their own bombing doctrine was different, often focusing on dive bombing, which required a different type of site. While they examined the Norden's technology, they didn't rush to copy it. The oath of secrecy and the elaborate destruction procedures were based on a misplaced fear. The story of the Norden bomb site is a classic example of the gap between technological promise and battlefield reality. In the lab, it was a revolution. In the chaos of war, it was a useful but flawed tool. Its greatest contribution may have been psychological. For the crews flying dangerous missions, and for the public back home, the belief in the miracle bomb site provided a powerful morale boost. It created the conviction that the missions were not just dropping bombs randomly, but were striking precise military and industrial targets, making the immense cost and sacrifice seem worthwhile. As detailed in Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Bomber Mafia, the entire American air power strategy was built on the promise of this device, a promise that was never fully kept. Did the immense investment in the Norden bomb site's development and production divert resources from other potentially more effective technologies like improved radar or navigation aids? How did the bombardiers who swore to die for the bomb site feel when they learned its secrets were already known to the enemy? And if the pickle barrel accuracy was a myth, how should that change our historical understanding of the strategic bombing campaign itself? Number 11. Who made the B-17G the fortress it was? Look at a picture of an early B-17, like the E or F model. Then look at the final, definitive version, the B-17G. You'll see one obvious difference that changed everything. It's a small lump under the nose of the plane housing 2.50 caliber machine guns. This was the Bendix chin turret. Its addition was not just a minor upgrade, it was a life-saving innovation that finally addressed the B-17's greatest tactical weakness, the head-on attack. For the first few years of the air war, enemy fighter pilots learned that the safest way to attack a B-17 formation was from the front. The early B-17s had a few manually aimed machine guns in the plexiglass nose, but they provided a very limited field of fire. Skilled fighter pilot could fly directly at the bomber, guns blazing, and be in and out of range before the nose gunners could get a good shot at him. These head-on attacks were devastatingly effective and a major source of B-17 losses. The bombers were not the impenetrable fortresses they were supposed to be. The problem was well known to the crews and commanders. The Air Force tried various field modifications to add more forward-firing guns, but they were often clumsy and ineffective. The failed YB-40 gunship project had experimented with a chin turret, and its performance was one of the few bright spots of that program. Well, the Air Force took that lesson to heart. They needed a permanent factory-installed solution. The Bendix Corporation, which already made the B-17's upper and lower turrets, was tasked with designing a remote-controlled turret that could be fitted to the nose. The resulting chin turret was a compact, powerful solution. It was aimed by the bombardier, who was already in the nose of the plane. He used a control yoke and a gun sight to aim the turret's two guns. This finally gave the B-17 a powerful, forward-facing defense. When enemy fighters now came in from the front, they were flying directly into the sights of two heavy machine guns. The odds had changed. The first B-17G models with the chin turret began arriving in England in late 1943. Their impact was immediate. Fighter pilots who had grown accustomed to the relative safety of a head-on attack were now facing a wall of lead. The tactic became much more dangerous and less effective. In his book Flying Fortress, author Edward Jablonski quotes numerous pilots from the period who noted the dramatic difference the B-17G made. The addition of the chin turret, combined with the availability of long-range fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustang, was a turning point in the air war. It plugged a critical defensive gap and made the bomber much more capable of surviving its journey. Of the 12,731 B-17s built, over 8,600 were the G model. It became the workhorse of the 8th Air Force for the final, most intense phase of the war. The chin turret is the single easiest way to identify a B-17G. It's a small detail, but it represents a crucial lesson learned in the brutal classroom of aerial combat. It was a direct response to a deadly threat, an engineering solution that saved countless lives and finally made the front of the B-17 a place that attackers feared. Given how obvious the B-17's frontal weakness was, why did it take so long, nearly 2 years of combat, to develop and implement a factory solution like the chin turret? Were there other competing designs for a forward turret that were considered and rejected? And how did the role of the bombardier change now that he was responsible for both dropping bombs and operating a primary defensive weapon system? Number 10, was the B-17 really obsolete? By 1944, the B-17 had a new stablemate in the skies over Europe, the consolidated B-24 Liberator, and by almost every statistical measure, the B-24 was a better airplane. It was faster, it could fly farther, it could carry a much larger bomb load. Its modern design with its high aspect ratio Davis wing made it more efficient. On paper, the B-17, whose basic design dated back to the mid-1930s, looked like a relic. The B-24 seemed to be the future. Many in the Air Force High Command, including General Jimmy Doolittle, preferred the Liberator and wanted to phase out the B-17. But the B-17 crews felt differently. They loved their Fortress, and there were good reasons why. The number one reason was survivability. The B-17 had a reputation for being able to absorb an incredible amount of punishment and still bring its crew home. Its strong, over-engineered wing spar ran through the fuselage, giving the whole structure immense rigidity. Stories and photographs from the war are filled with B-17s that made it back to England with huge sections of the tail missing, with engines on fire, or with fuselages riddled with hundreds of holes from shells and bullets. The plane was remarkably stable and easy to fly, even with extensive damage. The B-24, for all its modern design, did not share this reputation. Its thin Davis wing was efficient, but it was also more vulnerable to damage. The B-24's fuselage was built around a narrow bomb bay, and crews had to walk across a thin catwalk, nicknamed the Catwalk of Terror, to get from the front of the plane to the back. If the plane was hit, this catwalk could be a death trap. The B-24 was also known to be more difficult to fly, especially in the tight formations required for mutual defense. It was less stable than the B-17. A common saying among crews was that the B-24 could carry you to the target, but the B-17 would bring you home. Another key advantage for the B-17 was its high-altitude performance. Thanks to its large wing area and powerful turbo-superchargers, the B-17 had a higher operational ceiling than the B-24. It was more comfortable flying in the thin air above 25,000 feet. This ability to fly higher made it a more difficult target for anti-aircraft guns and gave it an edge in the strategic high-altitude bombing campaign. The debate between the two planes raged throughout the war. The production numbers show that both were built in massive quantities. But in the European theater, the B-17 remained the favored child of the 8th Air Force. The crews trusted it. In his memoir, Serenade to the Big Bird, B-17 pilot Bert Stiles wrote with deep affection about his plane, treating it almost as a living member of the crew. This psychological factor, the confidence the crews had in their aircraft, cannot be measured on a spec sheet, but it was a powerful force. The B-17 might have been technically inferior in some ways, but its toughness and the trust it inspired made it the right plane for many of the men who had to fly it into combat day after day. It was an old design that refused to quit. Was the B-17's reputation for toughness a measurable engineering fact, or was it a psychological phenomenon amplified by memorable stories and photographs? If the USAF had standardized on only the B-24 for the European theater, would the bombing campaign have been more or less effective? And how much does a crew's subjective trust in their machine matter when compared to its objective performance statistics? Number 9. What happened to them all after the war? In 1945, the skies over Europe and the Pacific were filled with B-17s. Thousands of them sat on airfields from England to Guam. A few years later, they were almost all gone. And the end of the war meant the end of the B-17's career as a frontline bomber. The jet age was beginning. The B-29 Superfortress had already made the B-17 obsolete, and new planes like the B-36 and B-50 were on the drawing board. The vast fleet of Flying Fortresses was now a surplus problem. The story of what happened to these 12,000 planes is a story of scrapping, strange second careers, and a last-minute race to save a few from extinction. The vast majority of B-17s met a swift and unceremonious end. They were flown to massive aircraft boneyards in the American Southwest, places like Kingman, Arizona, and Walnut Ridge, Arkansas. The dry desert air prevented them from rusting. There, they were parked in long, silent rows, waiting for their fate. The government sold them for scrap. For a few $100s, you could buy a B-17. Huge guillotines were set up to chop the planes into manageable pieces. The aluminum was melted down to make cars, refrigerators, and pots and pans. The engines of war were literally beaten into plowshares. Within 2 years of the war's end, the B-17 fleet had been almost entirely destroyed, but a few hundred escaped the scrap heap and went on to have new adventures. Some were converted into VIP transports, some were used by the Coast Guard for long-range air-sea rescue, where they were fitted with a lifeboat that could be dropped to survivors in the water. These were designated B-17H, later PB-1G. The Air Force itself kept a number of them for various utility roles. The most interesting of these were the radio-controlled drones. In Operation Crossroads, the 1946 atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll, unmanned B-17s were flown through the mushroom clouds to collect air samples and radiation data. These drone B-17s, designated QB-17, were also used as flying targets for testing new air-to-air missiles in the 1950s. In the civilian world, the B-17 found a new life as a firebomber. Companies like Aero Union converted them to carry tanks of water or fire retardant in their old bomb bays. For decades, B-17s were a common sight in the skies over western states, battling forest fires. Others were used for aerial surveying and mapping, or for pesticide spraying. A few even ended up in the hands of private owners who flew them for fun. The famous Memphis Belle sat in a field in Tennessee for years, slowly deteriorating before being rescued and restored. Today, fewer than 50 B-17 airframes survive in the world. Of those, only about a dozen are still in flying condition. Organizations like the Experimental Aircraft Association and the Collins Foundation painstakingly maintain and fly these survivors, offering rides to the public. They are living museums, a tangible link to the past. They are incredibly expensive to operate and maintain, requiring a dedicated team of volunteers and a constant search for rare spare parts. The journey of the B-17 from a mass-produced weapon of war to a scrap commodity, and finally to a treasured and rare artifact, is a powerful story about how we value the machines that shape our history. How many potentially historic B-17s with unique combat records were melted down without anyone realizing their significance? All what was the decision-making process that determined which few planes would be saved for museum or utility use and which thousands would be destroyed. And as the last generation of B-17 mechanics and pilots ages, who will carry on the knowledge needed to keep the few remaining flying examples in the air? Number 8, why were two men in the nose so crowded? The front of a B-17 is its most iconic feature, a large plexiglass cone that seems to offer a panoramic view of the world. It looks spacious from the outside, but inside that cone, two of the most critical members of the crew, the navigator and the bombardier, had to do their incredibly complex jobs in a cramped and chaotic workspace. It was an office with the worst conditions imaginable. The navigator's primary job was to know where the plane was, where it was going, and how to get it back home. His desk was a small table on the port side of the nose compartment behind the bombardier. Here, he worked with maps, charts, and a dizzying array of instruments. He had to calculate the plane's position using dead reckoning, pilotage, and sometimes celestial navigation with a sextant. He also had to constantly calculate the wind's effect on the plane, a factor known as drift, to ensure they stayed on course. A small error could mean missing the target or running out of fuel over hostile territory. His job required intense concentration, precision, and calm calculation in the middle of a terrifying environment. Just a few feet in front of him sat the bombardier. For most of the flight, the bombardier's job was to act as a forward gunner, manning the nose guns. But as the plane approached the target, his role changed. He would lie on his stomach and peer through the eyepiece of the Norden bomb sight. As mentioned earlier, his task was to guide the plane on its final run and release the bombs at the exact right moment. He was responsible for the success or failure of the mission's primary objective. These two men, with their high-stakes, high-pressure jobs, were crammed into a small, uninsulated space. It was freezing cold. They were surrounded by the rattling of machine guns and the roar of the engines. And they had the clearest view of the dangers ahead. They could see the black puffs of anti-aircraft fire, what the crews called flak, exploding around them. They could see the enemy fighters coming straight at them, their cannons winking as they fired. There was no armor plate in front of them, just a thin sheet of plexiglass. Psychologically, it was one of the most frightening positions on the plane. The design of the nose compartment created its own problems. In his book, The Wild Blue, historian Stephen Ambrose describes the accounts of B-17 crewmen who talked about the challenges of working in this space. If one man needed to move, the other had to get out of the way. If a gun jammed, the bombardier had to crawl over the navigator station to fix it. If the plane was damaged and they had to bail out, the escape hatch was small and awkward to get to. The navigator and bombardier had to coordinate their escape. Their shared workspace under the stress of combat could be a place of intense friction or incredible teamwork. Their survival depended on their ability to work together in a space that seemed designed to make it difficult. Why was the nose compartment designed with such little regard for human factors and ergonomics, forcing two crew members with critical jobs into such a confined space? How did the constant visual exposure to danger affect the rates of combat fatigue for navigators and bombardiers compared to other crew positions? And did the close proximity and shared danger create a unique bond between the two men in the nose that was different from the relationships among the rest of the crew? Number 7 was the waist gunner position, a waste of space. In the middle of the B-17's fuselage, there were 2 large open windows, one on each side. Sticking out of each window was a .50 caliber machine gun. Behind each gun stood a man, the waist gunner. In movies and photographs, they are often the most dramatic figures, bundled in fleece-lined jackets, firing their guns at attacking fighters. But from a military efficiency standpoint, the waist gunner position was one of the most problematic and least effective on the entire aircraft. The problem was the setup. The 2 waist gunners stood just a few feet apart in an open, unheated part of the plane. They were blasted by the freezing slipstream for hours on end. Their guns were manually aimed, mounted on a simple pintle, and firing accurately from a moving, vibrating platform at a fast-moving target was incredibly difficult. The gunners had to lead the target, firing at where it was going to be, not where it was. This required immense skill and instinct, something that was hard to teach. Furthermore, the 2 gunners were often in each other's way. If a fighter was attacking from the left, the right waist gunner could do nothing to help. If the attack came from an angle where both could theoretically shoot, they had to be careful not to hit their own plane's tail or each other. And a study of combat reports revealed a fundamental flaw in the concept. It was found that when a fighter attacked from one side, both waist gunners would often fire at it, even the one on the opposite side shooting across the fuselage. They were so focused on the threat that they wasted ammunition and created a dangerous crossfire inside their own plane. Recognizing this inefficiency, the Air Force made a significant change in the later models of the B-17G. They staggered the waist gun positions. The right waist window was moved further forward than the left one. This gave each gunner a clearer field of fire and prevented them from getting in each other's way. They also added enclosed windows that could be opened when needed, which offered some protection from the brutal cold. But the fundamental problem remained: two men were being used for a job that was difficult to do effectively. Major General Curtis LeMay, a key commander in the 8th Air Force and later the head of Strategic Air Command, was famously pragmatic and focused on efficiency. He was known to be skeptical of the actual contribution of the waist gunners compared to the turrets, which were power-operated and more accurate. The resources, in terms of manpower and weight, used for the two waist gun positions might have been better used elsewhere. For example, carrying more ammunition for the more effective tail and turret guns, or even carrying more fuel or bombs. The waist gunner position highlights the evolution of bomber defense. It was a holdover from an earlier era of aviation. As the war progressed, the thinking shifted towards more powered, centrally controlled defensive systems. But for the thousands of men who flew as waist gunners, their job was a cold, difficult, and terrifying reality. They were a visible and symbolic part of the B-17's defense, even if their actual effectiveness was a subject of debate among the strategists on the ground. Did the Air Force ever conduct a definitive study to measure the actual combat effectiveness of the waist gunners versus other defensive positions? How did the men who served as waist gunners perceive their own role and importance within the 10-man crew? And if you were to redesign the B-17's defensive armament, knowing what we know now, would you eliminate the waist gun positions entirely, and what would you replace them with? Number 6. What was the assembly ship? For a B-17 mission to succeed, the bombers had to fly in a tight, disciplined formation. This combat box allowed them to combine their defensive firepower against enemy fighters. But forming up this box was a huge challenge. Hundreds of bombers would take off, often in poor weather, from dozens of different airfields all over eastern England. They had to find each other in the sky and get into their precise positions before heading out over the sea. This process of assembly could take over an hour, and it was chaotic and dangerous. To solve this problem, the Air Force came up with a strange and colorful solution: the assembly ship. An assembly ship, sometimes called a Judas Goat, or formation ship, was an old war-weary B-17 or B-24 that was retired from combat duty. It was stripped of its guns and armor to save weight. Its only job was to be seen. To that end, these planes were painted in the most outlandish, garish, and high-visibility schemes imaginable. They were covered in bright stripes, polka dots, or checkerboard patterns in colors like red, yellow, and white. They were also fitted with extra lights and pyrotechnic flare guns. The process worked like this. The assembly ship would take off first and fly to a designated rendezvous point, usually a radio beacon over the English countryside. It would then fly a slow, wide circle. The combat bombers from its group, taking off from their base, would look for their group's unique, brightly colored assembly ship. They would join up on its wing, and gradually the entire combat box would form. Once the group was fully assembled and in proper formation, the assembly ship's job was done. It would peel off and fly back to base, its crew having never left the relative safety of English airspace. These planes had colorful, unofficial names that often reflected their appearance, like Spotted Cow or the Little Gramper. They were a vital part of mission logistics, saving time, fuel, and reducing the risk of mid-air collisions during the difficult assembly phase. The crews of the assembly ships were often tower expired, veterans, or personnel who were not medically cleared for high-altitude combat. It was considered an easy and safe assignment. The concept of the assembly ship shows the kind of practical, field-level innovation that was common during the war. It wasn't a solution that came from a high-level command. It was a clever fix developed by the bomb groups themselves to solve a pressing operational problem. They took an old, otherwise useless airframe and gave it a new and important purpose. The archives of the various bomb groups, such as the 381st or the 100th, are filled with photographs of these bizarrely beautiful aircraft, a stark contrast to the drab, olive-green bombers they led into formation. They were the shepherds for the flock of fortresses. Were there ever any instances of an assembly ship being mistaken for a legitimate target by friendly fire or a lone enemy intruder? Who designed the wild paint schemes, and was there any official system, or was it left to the creativity of the ground crews at each base? And why was this simple, effective idea seemingly unique to the 8th Air Force's bomber operations in England? Number 5, could a B-17 fly itself? The idea of an unmanned drone aircraft seems like a product of the 21st century, but in the 1940s, the U.S. Army Air Forces were already experimenting with a radical and dangerous program to turn B-17s into the world's first smart bombs. The project had the code name Operation Aphrodite. The plan was to take old, worn-out B-17s, strip them of everything non-essential, and pack them with over 20,000 pounds of high explosives, more than double a normal bomb load. The idea was to fly these flying bombs into hardened, high-value targets that were difficult to destroy with conventional bombing, such as submarine pens or V-weapon sites. The B-17 drone, designated BQ-7, would not be unmanned for its entire flight. A two-man crew, a pilot, and a co-pilot engineer would handle the takeoff. This was the most dangerous part of the mission. They were essentially taking off in a giant flying bomb. Once the plane was airborne and flying steadily, the crew would arm the explosives, set the radio controls, and then bail out over England. From that point on, the BQ-7 would be controlled remotely from a mother ship, another B-17 flying behind it. The mothership had a television camera mounted in its nose, which received a signal from a camera in the nose of the drone. This gave the remote pilot a view of where the drone was heading. Using radio signals, he would guide the BQ-7 to its target and crash it, hopefully triggering a massive explosion that would destroy the target. It was a bold and technologically ambitious plan, a forerunner of today's drone warfare and television-guided missiles. The program was plagued with problems. The radio control systems were primitive and unreliable. The television picture was fuzzy and difficult to interpret. But the biggest problem was the danger to the volunteer crews who had to fly the initial takeoff. In August 1944, a BQ-7 took off from a base in England, targeting a V-weapon site in France. The plane was packed with Torpex, a powerful explosive. On board were 2 pilots from the U.S. Navy, which was participating in the program. One of them was Lieutenant Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., the older brother of future President John F. Kennedy. Before the crew had a chance to bail out, the explosives detonated prematurely over the English countryside. The plane was completely obliterated, and both men were killed. The Kennedy tragedy was a major blow to the program. Several more missions were attempted with very little success. The drones were difficult to control, and they often crashed or missed their targets. In the end, Operation Aphrodite was deemed a failure and canceled. It was too ambitious for the technology of its time. The idea of a remotely piloted, precision-guided weapon was sound, but the electronics and guidance systems of the 1940s were just not up to the task. It was a glimpse into the future of warfare, but a future that was still decades away. The B-17, a plane flown by 10-man crews, had a brief, secret, and tragic career as a pilotless drone. What exactly caused the premature detonation that killed Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., and was it a technical malfunction or a flaw in the explosive arming procedure? How were the volunteer pilots for these incredibly dangerous missions selected, and what was their mindset? And if Operation Aphrodite had been successful, how would it have changed the ethics and strategies of aerial warfare in the final year of the conflict? Number 4, how did one plane become so many? The B-17 is often spoken of as a single entity, but the Flying Fortress that flew in 1945 was a radically different machine from the one that flew in 1941. The aircraft went through a constant, rapid evolution driven by the brutal feedback of combat. There were 13 major variants of the B-17, from the first prototype to the final G model. Each new letter in its designation represented a lesson learned in blood. The first models to see combat were the B-17C and D. These were the planes that fought in the early difficult days in the Pacific. They had a limited number of hand-operated machine guns and a significant vulnerability in the tail. The rear firing defense consisted of a gunner lying on the floor shooting through a small tunnel. It was an awkward and ineffective position. The B-17E, which first appeared in late 1941, was a massive leap forward. It was the first model to feature the now famous large tail fin and a tail gunner position with 2.50 caliber guns. This change, according to Martin Keiden's research, was a direct response to the tactic of attacking from the rear. The E model also added a powered dorsal turret behind the cockpit and a remote-controlled ventral turret, which was later replaced by the ball turret. It was the first B-17 that truly looked like the Flying Fortress of legend. The B-17F was the workhorse of 1942 and 1943. It was a refinement of the E model, with improved engines and a one-piece plexiglass nose. The famous Memphis Belle was an F model. But the F model still had a critical flaw, the weak forward defense that made head-on attacks so deadly. This led to the development of the definitive B-17G. As discussed earlier, the B-17G's most important feature was the chin turret, which solved the problem of frontal attacks. But there were many other, less obvious changes. The waist gun positions were staggered to improve their fields of fire. More armor was added to protect the crew. The fuel tanks were made self-sealing more effectively. The propellers were improved. These were not revolutionary changes, but a series of small incremental improvements that, taken together, made the G model a much more effective and survivable aircraft. This process of evolution was constant. Ground crews in England would often make their own field modifications to the planes, adding extra guns or armor based on the experiences of the flight crews. If a modification proved successful, it would often be incorporated into the next production block coming off the assembly lines in Seattle. The plane was being redesigned in real time based on daily feedback from the battlefield. The B-17 was not a static design. It was a living, changing weapon system. The difference between an early B-17C and a late B-17G was the difference between a promising but flawed design and a battle-hardened, optimized machine. Which specific combat incident or after-action report was the primary catalyst for the decision to add the tail gunner position in the B-17E? How much friction was there between the engineers at Boeing and the commanders in the field, who were demanding constant changes that could disrupt the production lines? And if the B-17G had been the model available from the very beginning of the war, how dramatically would that have changed the casualty rates for the 8th Air Force? Number 3, how much did a single mission cost? We often think about the human cost of war, but the financial and logistical cost of a single B-17 mission was also staggering. To get one heavy bomber with its 10-man crew over a target in Germany and back again required a amount of resources that is difficult to comprehend. The B-17 was not just a plane, it was the tip of a very large and very expensive spear. Let's start with the aircraft itself. A B-17G cost about $238,000 to build in 1944. That's equivalent to over $3,500,000 in today's money. A mission might involve several hundred bombers. The cost of just the aircraft in the air for a single large raid could be close to $1 billion in modern currency. Then there's the fuel. A B-17 carried about 2,700 gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline. For a long-range mission, it would burn almost all of it. A 500-plane raid would consume well over 1 million gallons of fuel. This fuel had to be refined in the United States, shipped across the Atlantic in vulnerable tanker convoys, and then transported by pipeline and truck to dozens of airfields in England. The logistical chain was immense. Next, the bombs. A typical bomb load was around 4,000 to 5,000 pounds. For a 500-plane raid, that's over 2 million pounds of high explosives. Each bomb had to be manufactured, fitted with a fuse, shipped overseas, and carefully loaded onto the aircraft by ground crews. The same goes for the .50 caliber ammunition for the machine guns. Each B-17G carried thousands of rounds. A single mission could expend millions of rounds of ammunition. But the biggest cost was in the people. It took a 10-man crew to fly the plane, but for every man in the air, there were dozens of people on the ground supporting him. There were mechanics, armorers, radio technicians, cooks, clerks, and medics. A typical bomb group had several thousand personnel to support just a few dozen aircraft. The cost of recruiting, training, feeding, and housing this vast army of support staff was a massive part of the mission's overall expense. The training for a single pilot from his first flight to his arrival at a combat group was a long and expensive process, an investment of tens of thousands of dollars per man. When a B-17 failed to return, all of that investment was lost. The plane, the fuel it carried, the bombs, and most tragically, the 10 highly trained crewmen. The economic calculation of the air war was brutal. Planners had to weigh the cost of these losses against the damage being inflicted on the enemy's industrial capacity. The reports from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey conducted after the war attempted to make this very calculation, analyzing the economic impact of the bombing campaign. The numbers are a stark reminder that war is not just a matter of tactics and strategy, but also of logistics and economics on a scale that is almost unimaginable. How did the USAF track and manage the immense logistical tail of the 8th Air Force, and what was the single biggest bottleneck in the supply chain? If you were to calculate the return on investment for a single bombing mission, weighing the total cost against the estimated economic damage to the target, what would the numbers look like? And did the immense cost of the strategic bombing campaign ever cause political leaders to question its value compared to other military expenditures? Number 2, what did the crews fear more than fighters? Ask a B-17 crewman what the most dangerous part of a mission was, and you might expect him to say the flak over the target or the swarms of enemy fighters. But for many veterans, the single most terrifying and emotionally draining event of any mission was something else entirely, a mid-air collision with another B-17. The bombers flew in massive, tightly packed formations. A combat box could contain 50 or 60 planes, with only a few hundred feet separating them horizontally and vertically. They were flying at over 200 miles per hour, often in poor visibility or thick clouds. The pilots had to fly with intense, unwavering concentration for hours on end, constantly adjusting their speed and position to stay in formation. A moment's inattention, a sudden patch of turbulence, or a mechanical problem could lead to disaster. If two 30-ton bombers, loaded with fuel and bombs, touched in mid-air, the result was almost always catastrophic. Both planes would be instantly destroyed in a massive fireball. There was no chance of survival for the 20 men on board. The crews flying nearby would witness this sudden, horrific event, a stark reminder of how close they were to the same fate. The psychological impact of seeing a friendly plane, with men you knew, simply vanish in an instant was profound. The risk was highest during the assembly phase over England and when flying through thick cloud banks when pilots lost sight of the planes around them. They had to rely on their instruments and trust that everyone else would hold their exact position. Another moment of extreme danger was on the bomb run. The entire formation had to fly straight and level with no evasive maneuvers to allow the bombardiers to sight the target. This made them a stable target for anti-aircraft guns, but it also increased the risk of collision if a plane was hit by flak and lost control. In his book, Masters of the Air, Donald L. Miller recounts numerous first-hand accounts from veterans who described mid-air collisions as their greatest fear. Unlike being shot down by the enemy, which was a part of the job they had trained for, a collision felt like a senseless, random accident. It was a danger that came not from the enemy, but from within their own formation. It was a betrayal by the very element, the tight formation that was supposed to protect them. The records of the 8th Air Force show that a significant number of aircraft and crew losses were not due to combat, but to operational accidents, with mid-air collisions being a major cause. This constant underlying fear of collision added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming experience. It was a threat that required a different kind of courage, not the courage to fight an enemy, but the discipline and focus to fly perfectly for hours on end, knowing that the smallest mistake could be fatal for you and for the crew of the plane next to you. How many B-17s were actually lost to mid-air collisions compared to enemy action, and is there a reliable statistical record? What changes to formation doctrine or flight procedures were made during the war specifically to reduce the risk of collisions? And did the fear of collision ever cause pilots to fly a looser, less defensively effective formation, even if it was against orders? Number 1 was the Flying Fortress, a misleading name. The name is powerful, Flying Fortress. It conjures an image of an invincible sky battleship, bristling with guns, able to fly anywhere and defend itself against all attackers. This was the image that Boeing's marketing department and the U.S. Army Air Corps wanted to project. The name was born when a Seattle reporter, Richard Williams, saw the prototype Model 299 with its many machine gun blisters and called it a Flying Fortress. The name stuck. It was a brilliant piece of public relations. But for the men who flew it into combat, the name was a cruel irony. In the early years of the air war, from 1942 to early 1944, the B-17 was anything but a fortress. The initial doctrine of the USAF was that formations of B-17s could defend themselves without fighter escort. This theory of the self-defending bomber was central to their entire strategic bombing plan. It was tested in the skies over Europe, and it was proven tragically wrong. Missions to heavily defended targets deep inside Germany resulted in catastrophic losses. The raid on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and Regensburg on August 17, 1943 saw 60 B-17 shot down out of a force of 376. A second raid on Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, known as Black Thursday, was even worse. Of the 291 B-17s that attacked the target, 60 were lost and many more were damaged beyond repair. The loss rate was over 25%. The 8th Air Force could not sustain such losses. The Flying Fortress was being systematically slaughtered. The problem was that no matter how many guns a bomber had, it was still a large, relatively slow-moving target. A determined fighter pilot could always find a way to attack it. The B-17's defenses, while formidable, could be overwhelmed by coordinated attacks. The theory of the self-defending bomber was a failure. The unescorted B-17 was a vulnerable target, not an impregnable fortress. The thing that finally allowed the B-17 to survive and be effective was not its own guns, but the arrival of a true bodyguard, the long-range escort fighter. In late 1943 and early 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt, equipped with drop tanks, and especially the P-51 Mustang, began to accompany the bombers all the way to the target and back. The P-51, with its incredible range and performance, could take on the German fighters and beat them in their own airspace. The job of the B-17s became to get to the target and drop their bombs. The job of the P-51s was to protect them. This combination of the bomber and the long-range fighter was the winning formula. It was the fighter escort that finally made the daylight bombing campaign sustainable. The B-17 was a crucial part of that system, but it was not the fortress of its own name. It was a tough, resilient, and well-armed aircraft that could do its job effectively, but only when it was protected. The name Flying Fortress was a myth, a piece of powerful propaganda. The reality was that the B-17 was a brave but vulnerable machine that ultimately depended on its little friends for survival. Did the early belief in the self-defending bomber constitute a catastrophic failure of leadership and doctrine within the USAF High Command? How did the crews on the front lines feel about the Flying Fortress name during the period of heaviest losses when their reality was so different from the propaganda? And if the P-51 Mustang had never been developed, would the entire American strategy of daylight precision bombing have been abandoned as a failure?